Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm your stylish scientist, Professor Peter Jonason, and I want to talk to you today about something I'm interested in more than I have ever been really interested in anything in quite a while in research, and I want to call it local calibration. It's a fancy way of describing how people may, um, over their lifetime, calibrate their personality, their mate preferences, any of this kind of stuff to local conditions. Now, this is not a new idea by any means, but it's not well done with, for example, the dark triad, which we'll focus on today. But it's not done well in general. And so I want to go through some of my mistakes and tell you what those revealed and what I would prefer to do, and some of the limitations of this kind of area of intellectual endeavor. We're all, I think, comfortable with the idea that people differ from place to place to place. So while people have different personality traits, there's a different vibe in different places, right? Different values in different places. And usually the way people approach this research, cross-cultural psychologists, for example, is through the lens of social psychology. And so the mechanisms that are proposed are social psychological in nature. So gender inequality, individualism, collectivism, things that you've heard lots and lots of times, and things that you probably even kind of would intuitively express as the things that matter, right? You'd say culture matters. And of course, I would say to you, well, what the hell does that mean? What does culture mean? And so a better approach, I think, would be one given to us from evolutionary psychology, which is the idea that culture is an emergent property of the conditions in the society, right? It's not something that's installed from above by magic, right? It's something that emerges from what we have, from the availability of food, from the temperature, from all these other kinds of things, right? So what I want to talk a little bit today is about the cultural, and by cultural I mean country, but the cultural calibration, the cultural factors, the pan statewide factors that might relate to things like the dark triad and maybe where we could go with this kind of research in the future. Now, one of the limitations of this research, and there's several of course, is that usually when people do cross-cultural psychology, in particular on the dark triad, there hasn't been much good work on this, we focus on things like this here, right? And this here, and this here. And while I have samples from Australia, Brazil, Hungary, Japan, Russia, the United States, if I didn't mention that, what we're doing here is simply looking in this kind of voyeuristic way about how some correlation may or may not exist in different places. And it's kind of the implicit assumption is that countries are so different that they might be, the correlations might be different. But this is a problematic assumption. It violates Occam's razor. Unless you have a good reason to think that, say, Japanese people are going to be different on a particular variable than Americans, all you've done is really used these different samples in a convenient way to just say, look, we collected data from all these places. And indeed, in these studies I've just shown you, that's really all we did. And so we didn't really choose those nations for any particular reason other than I knew enough people from around the world at this point in my career that I could get people to collect data from those places. And it's not many places, right? Collecting cross-cultural data as some of the kind of larger scale work that we'll get to in a second. Maybe you get 50 countries, right? There are hundreds of countries, not hundreds, but well over 100 countries. But you rarely see studies that have all of the countries. And so you have 6. Well, why these 6? Well, in these cases, which are all based on the same data set, there was no reason other than this convenience aspect. Another problem with these studies that I've just shown you, you've seen, and of course any studies you want to see, they're on my website, www.peterjonason.com, remember, and the publications page. We proposed no mechanism. So imagine we discovered a difference between Japanese people and Russian people on narcissism. We haven't prepared in advance to say, well, why would they differ, right? What are the things that account for that difference, right? And that's an important kind of planning thing you have to do. There really wasn't any planning on these studies. I got lots of publications out of this data set, don't get me wrong, but there wasn't much planning other than, here are a few ideas I want to test. It was a bit like that, if I'm honest. So you'd say, well, 6 is not enough, right? So let's get some data with some more participants, right? What about studies that have, let's say, 50 something, right? So like this study here, right? So in this data set here for David Schmidt, I think we had something like 52 countries, and we showed some really cool things, right? So for example, in the case of Machiavellianism, as you see here, right? This suggests that as people move farther away from the equator, Machiavellianism scores go up. Now this is Machiavellianism at the state level. It's not Machiavellianism of particular individuals, right? It's just over the entire state. The average Machiavellianism scores around various countries is correlated with how far they are from the equator. Now, what this means, no idea, right? This is a very underwhelming. It's provocative, certainly, but it's underwhelming in the sense that there's so many hypotheses that might account for this, and the correlation is not particularly large. It's only about 0.25. But that's not all that surprising, given we have such a small sample size. Indeed, the studies like of this kind tend to be rather underpowered and therefore underwhelming, because you don't have enough sample size, enough countries, even if you get all the countries in the world, to really get statistically significant effects. And so you end up having correlations that are quite nice, 0.3, 0.4, that might not even be significant because you have such a small number. Now, we also showed in this same study something else here with narcissism, which is apparently the opposite effect, right? That the closer you get to the equator, the more narcissistic that you become. Again, another provocative study. So maybe what you find here with Machiavellianism has to do with maybe it's modernization, maybe it's westernization, maybe it's temperature even, right? So, for example, if it's temperature, then maybe it has to do with Machiavellianism's the disposition's tendency to make people plan ahead for the future. And if you live in Norway, Sweden, right, there is a seasonality to it. And it may be that it's the seasonality, right? Because over decades and decades and decades and decades of living in these places, people's personality is calibrated to say, look, winter is coming. We need to plan ahead. Okay? But in Miami, in Italy, in Greece, in Spain, no, not necessary. Why? Because there is no real seasonality there. It doesn't freeze there. Food is essentially always available, and so they can instead engage in a kind of, let's call it, short-term thinking, moderately hedonistic kind of lifestyle. These are all possible hypotheses that haven't been tested, and they're very hard to test because you'd have to recollect this kind of data again. In another study, here, this one we did with all these people, 49 countries, we looked at how variability at the state level, and now in the dark triad again, of course, provides some interesting and tantalizing correlations, as you can see here, but they're a little bit underwhelming, if I'm honest. So, for example, we find things like at narcissism, and this is just the top line here. If you look at the top line of this, right? As narcissism goes up, so does the Human Development Index scores of those countries. Remember, again, this is at the country level. So we're really not explaining people, we're explaining what you might call a culture of narcissism, right? One of the criticisms of this kind of work, this looking at state level personality, for example, or anything at the state level, is it violates some assumptions, but one of them is that personality traits are supposed to be about people, personality, right? Not about states. And so there's a conceptual problem for some people about this. Now, I'm not saying that I don't think that problem exists. I'm saying that, look, we learn more information by doing more studies. We also find in this table over here about sex differences, right? We find that sex differences, the magnitude of those sex differences go up as the same thing, Human Development Index, goes up. So in more modern societies, okay, this is the gender paradox. This is the same table as you saw over here. Right now we're focusing on sex differences. As societies become more modern, the sex differences get larger, right? And this is a kind of a problematic feature for feminist theories because their hypothesis is that sex differences, the differences between men and women, are artifacts of this boogeyman of patriarchy. But just here, in one example I'm giving you, now you can go read the paper, right? This is Jonason et al. 2020. It suggests that narcissism, the sex differences in narcissism are sensitive to the Human Development Index scores. But unfortunately, the choice of what we put in this table, the choice of what we ran in analyses, is, let's call it haphazard. The reason it's haphazard, or maybe even opportunistic is a better word, is because there is hundreds of potential things you could put in here. You could probably develop a database where you take scores at the state level of every country you can slowly accumulate over time, and slowly accumulate more and more data at the country level for whatever you want, right? It could be availability of food, it could be how much red wine people drink, it could be anything, right? So we have to nail down at some point, what are we actually going to look at? Now, we have a study under review now, and I admit, in the introduction, in a footnote, I say, look, we recognize that there's an almost limitless amount of variables. In this case, we're looking at ecological, like weather and natural disasters. There's, in theory, an endless array of these, right? Number of earthquakes, I mean, on and on and on and on. And so it's very hard, and so you end up having to be a little bit just, okay, this is the best we can do, or you take a wide range, and then if you take a wide range, what have you done? You've inflated your type 1 error because you've increased the probability of finding things just by running more correlations. Excuse me, I'm going to get some more wine here for you. Okay, we have a very nice day here in Warsaw. The last one I want to give you here, in this paper here, I call it the milieu effects paper. And what does that mean? It simply means that the milieu that people live in particular in this study, the milieus that people grew up in, should influence their personality development. Now, the idea here is because we don't have longitudinal data, as in people when they were 2 experiencing something and then when they were 20, and it's very hard experimentally to induce the conditions that we think would generate personality. Like, it wouldn't just be a story that you read like you do in social psychology with priming effects. The expectation is that it would be lots of problematic things in your life, right? Because most people don't experience the traumas that are pivotal, like, that really change people. It's little things that accumulate over time that recalibrate your brain, right? Local calibration. And so in this milieu effects paper, we used the same data here from the last study, these 49 countries, and we found, for example, if you look down kind of in the middle, let's case with Machiavellianism, you find that Machiavellian scores at the state level, remember, are higher when education is higher. So more educated people appear to have, are more likely to have Machiavellian, or countries, that are more educated. Right? This may have to do with modernization, for example. Right? In contrast, narcissism gets the opposite effect. Right? In less educated states, narcissism is higher. Why? Maybe, as we'll get to in a minute, maybe because difficult conditions generate narcissistic responses. And I don't mean narcissism like you think of it as like a Freudian or any of that kind of stuff. What I mean is narcissism in the sense of pursuing your own selfish agenda, often at the cost of other people, right? You externalize the costs so you can get the benefits, yeah? And maybe that is the case, right? And that's what that brings us to the last study I want to talk about, this one here. It's from 2019. It has some problems. I know some cross-cultural psychologists don't like it. But I think it gives you the clearest kind of story that you can use to understand how personality, in this case in particular narcissism, is calibrated to local conditions. So I chose these 2 countries. Unlike the first time around we talked about, I picked these for strong reasons. One, Australia is the safest country in the world, or was at the time, for women. It might still be that. And if it's a safe country for women, it is invariably also then a safe country for men, right? Because the indexes are mostly about female safety, not male safety. We did, but we failed to meet some of the rigorous psychometric kind of testing things that are based on assumptions, what's called multi-groups confirmatory factor analysis. We didn't do so well there. But I'm not sure if this is all that necessary, especially if you just qualify your results and say that we didn't find this. Indeed, these kinds of super advanced statistical analyses might take us down really strange rabbit holes where we have to do ever increasingly more complex statistical analyses that make the story harder for not just us to tell as researchers, but also for the non-researcher to really process. Like, does it really matter if we don't have a exactly perfect estimate? It's like what researchers are, they're so tied up in their perfectionism that they can't just be pragmatic about it, right? And so I know a lot of colleagues who do these kind of assumption checks, and then they freeze because the assumption checks aren't met. Okay, right? But would you expect the structure of a particular measure, the way that the items correlate with one another, to be identical from place to place? I think there's an unreasonable expectation. This is a kind of moderately new kind of requirement in cross-cultural psychology. And it's meant to say, can you trust the comparisons that you're making at either when you're comparing means or when you're comparing correlations? And look, every data set is, let's be honest, fucked. Every data set, every study you've ever read is, right? And so if you believe as a researcher or as a person consuming science that any study that you've ever read or done is perfect, you're living in a fantasy land, right? Science is the imperfect process of honing in on the truth. If I find out that, say, the sample, my estimate of narcissism in one country is a little bit off, does that really matter in terms of our ability to draw conclusions about these things? And I would say no. I mean, pardon my old age, pardon my pragmatism, but I would say, look, I don't necessarily need a perfectly accurate estimate. Indeed, it's probable that people's dark triad score estimates are all underestimates because the nature of the score, the nature of the trait, people are going to underestimate, right? They're gonna, or our samples are nice kind of people. Right? So this study is comparing Australians and Turkish people, and we found, for example, sex differences, as you see here, right? So, for example, no surprise, men score higher than women on all the dark triad traits. In addition, there are some sex differences for how people perceive the world, right, as well, right? So these perceptions of the world, being dangerous or competitive, are meant as the mechanisms that might allow us to better understand the phrase of the day, local calibration of personality traits. We also find, as you see here, country differences, right? So, to no surprise, given how dangerous Turkey was and is still at this time, it's perceived as more competitive, more dangerous, more dangerous than Australia is. But similarly, there are country-level differences in the dark triad traits. Now, what's more interesting is this image here. Okay, I'll leave it up for a bit. I'll just talk from behind it. So what you'll see here are differences by country and by sex. And what you see is that regardless of the country, men do score higher than women do on narcissism. Okay, so men are more narcissistic everywhere you go than women are. But notice the magnitude of the difference. Notice the magnitude of the difference is smaller in Turkey than it is in Australia. So again, reaffirming this idea, this gender paradox, right? The fact that the sex differences are larger in the safer place. Okay, back to this particular figure though. The question then becomes, well, who's changing? Who's calibrating their personality? Because men, it seems, always benefit from being narcissistic. Men are always more narcissistic. But it seems like Turkish women, for some reason, are more narcissistic than Australian women. Now, it's true that Turkish men are more narcissistic than Australian men, but the biggest difference, as you see, is that Australian women, despite what I would like to believe, having lived there for all those years, and maybe that's maybe a good thing, is that Australian women are less narcissistic. And it's because it's not about the narcissism you think of when you think of narcissism. It's not the showiness and the materialism and all of that. What this is really capturing is the fact that Turkey is a more dangerous place. And that requires both men and women, but women in particular, to recalibrate, to reset their narcissism mechanisms, let's call them, yeah, to compete. And indeed, when we run further analysis, what we find is that the sex, so the country difference between in narcissism is accounted for primarily by how competitive men and women see their country to be, right? And so it suggests that the reason that Turkish women are so narcissistic relative to Australian women is because they are being activated. The competitiveness of the country activates them being narcissistic. Okay, so but of course, all of these studies, including this last one, has lots of limitations. But it's this last method that I like the most, and I plan to use it in a few subsequent studies. And I have people collecting data on some related topics now. One of the problems, of course, no surprise, is that a lot of our samples are either students or affluent people. And so what does that mean? Well, how is that a problem for us? Well, what it probably means, actually, is that we have underestimates of all these things, right? Students are likely to not only be richer, but they're also likely to have suffered less problems in their lives that would activate these traits. And so we're probably getting doubly underestimates of all of these effects. And even with that, right, even with a college student sample in Turkey, we're still able to detect these effects. And so does it matter that it's perfectly accurate? I don't think it does. What matters is the theory testing to me. And we have tested here a person by situation interaction derived by life history theory, an evolutionary theory, my favorite evolutionary theory, right? So we're not looking at sociocultural variables here. We're looking at something kind of more physical in the world, right? Like the world's dangerous. The world's competitive, right? Of course, there's other ways to describe your world. Unpredictability, for example. Harshness is another one. And we're working on collecting more robust data on this issue. It's not experimental, let's be honest, right? This is called the natural groups design. It's interesting data, it's interesting results, right? But what would be better is if we could manipulate some conditions in people's lives and people's minds that would activate or even attenuate their dark triad tendencies or anything. Now, it's problematic, I think, for personality, because I think with personality, it's a behavioral syndrome. It describes your kind of generalized tendency of dealing with the world, and generalized tendencies should be less susceptible to experimental manipulations than very specific things, like choices that you make. And so one of the methods that I'm really currently focused on developing now is moving us to using choices in the way we assess people's behavior, because I'm pretty sure that choices are flexible, but behavioral syndromes are much less flexible, all right? We have no kind of sense of how long it takes to make these changes in like the studies that we have or anything, right? So if I'm an immigrant from an old place that was dangerous, if I move from Turkey to Australia or Turkey to Poland, Poland apparently is very safe according to metrics these days. Okay, well, how long does it take? How long does it take to reset those things? Maybe, I would guess, this is my guess, a generation, unless you go through specific kind of training processes. I suspect it's about a generation or two before you're reset, right? So parents, maybe the next parents, and then you, right? You are reset. Now you're a local, right? Because I think the first generation kids are probably heavily infected by the immigrant families' expectations of the world. Then it kind of dwindles by the time you get to the second generation away. This is my prediction, okay? But this would be interesting to know is how long does it take for people to locally calibrate? It's very important when people are moving all over the world. How do you become part of a society, part of a culture, right? How long does it take? What do you have to do? Right? Of course, this study only reveals effects in narcissism. I have other data, of course, that reveals effects in psychopathies. We found a similar effect with narcissism as we found with data not with Turkey and Australia, but with clusters of weird versus non-weird countries. A very similar effect. I mean, actually, literally the same thing, just different, a different dependent variable and a different classification system. But now what I'm trying to work on is the local calibration of people's mate choice, the local calibration of their morality, and the local calibration of their motives. So we have a study already inches from publication on motives, looking at a way to measure motives. Now we have to do some local calibration. And it's the same thing with mating and morality. We're trying to move forward in this, and this is what I'm planning on doing for the next few years. We don't, as all of these studies, though, let's be honest, all the studies that we've discussed so far don't capture the variability within a country. There's several reasons why, one of which is that we just don't have the sample sizes to do this. This is a lot of money. To get people from all 20 of the states, right, of Italy, and I applied for a grant on this, it would have cost about €1 million. And why? Because this kind of data, it's not enough to have 100 people, right, which is the typical kind of social psychology sample size. You need really, honestly, more like 500 people, because then you get 250 men, 250 women from all the different places, and it just adds up, and it adds up, and it adds up, and granting bodies balk at this kind of money, but this is the only way to get trustworthy data. These studies like this that I had with 49 countries, like with David Schmidt, it's very opportunistic countries and very opportunistic sampling, so it's heavily biased towards students, towards young people, and all those things. So if you want good data on this, right, then it's a lot of money, and we just don't have that kind of. It also gets you into the problem of really complex statistical analyses. And if I'm honest, not only do I not know particularly complex statistical analyses, I'm unconvinced of their utility. I'm unconvinced that the fancy stats somehow provide better, more trustworthy answers than the simple ones. If you can't say it simply, I'm not sure if you can really say it at all, if I'm honest. And lastly, the last issue is that we run country-level analyses, which is okay, but what we're really trying to understand is how culture, and I don't mean culture like Eastern, Western, Muslim, Jewish, none of that, right? What I mean by culture are the conditions that we live in, right? And those are not just localized to countries, right? So the climate and conditions, for example, on one side of the boundary between France and Italy are basically the same. And so there's a greater degree of precision of local calibration we could get into, but we simply can't get into it. But we use country as a proxy for this. Okay? So this is a little bit long. Sorry about that. Maybe because I was drinking my wine, I was getting distracted. I hope you enjoyed this foray into this idea of local calibration. I hope you will consider local calibration in your research instead of just collecting data from one country or multiple countries opportunistically and not including things like potential mechanisms. Don't just do random cross-cultural research, right? Do it with some planning in mind. Choose countries. Contact colleagues and say, look, I'd like to collect data from Lebanon because X, Y, and Z, and I can compare Lebanon to, let's say, an American sample, right? And so more concerted effort and thought will generate better and stronger tests of this idea that who we are is not just as simple as our personality or our context. It's both, right? That our personality, our values, our morality, our mate choice, what we like in our clothes, who we want to date, is all calibrated by local conditions as well. All right? So, that's it for me. I'm Professor Peter Jonason, your stylist scientist, signing off.